For the last little over 9 years, I served on the staff of the bishop here in the Diocese of Indianapolis. But before that, I was for 11 years rector of St. Matthias Episcopal Church in Whittier, California, just outside of downtown Los Angeles. And so you may have noticed in the first reading this morning, we had the story of Matthias being called as one of the apostles, the casting of lots, and Matthias got to replace Judas among the 12. Now one day, when I was at St. Matthias on a Sunday morning after church, one of the people who had not attended the parish very long came up to me during the coffee hour and started to ask all sorts of questions about the church. And my thought was, wow, this is great. Someone who is curious about the parish and about the Episcopal Church, and I'm doing my best to fulfill all these questions with accuracy. And he's asking questions about what we believe about various, what you might say, ethical issues. Finally, he said, look, what I'm really trying to ask is, do you guys really, really believe in gambling? And I was, well, what do you mean by really, really? And he said, well, you have a stained glass window dedicated to gambling. So I figure that means that, like, you have people here to pray before they go to Las Vegas. And I was like, where's that stained glass window? And so he took me into the church, and he pointed up, and the church was sort of a mission-style church, and way up high, in fact, as if it was that window up there indeed was a stained glass window that had two big dice in it. It was for St. Matthias, the casting of lots, which means the rolling of dice to see who was going to be the 12th apostle once again. So, fortunately, I knew that story very well, and I could explain it to the fellow. But after that, I made sure that I worked into the announcements occasionally of finding the window dedicated to St. Matthias if you can. And eventually everyone was able to say, oh yeah, the dice are for St. Matthias, not for Las Vegas. Now, I tell you this story because St. Matthias is one of the least known of the apostles, and because I served a parish that had St. Matthias as its patron saint for 11 years, I grew to really respect and enjoy the story of St. Matthias, which, as you may remember from this morning's reading, there's the story of one of the apostles had betrayed Jesus in the form of Judas, and therefore had to be replaced. The apostles found two people who had been with Jesus for as long as they had, and so decided it was one of those two, and then they threw the dice to see who was going to become the 12th apostle, and Matthias won. You now know all there is to know about St. Matthias. Nothing else appears in the scriptures. Nothing else appears in legitimate writings, but we do not like not having information. And so all sorts of fantastic legends have been made up about St. Matthias through the centuries. One that comes out from probably about the 300s, so long after St. Matthias had died, is a legend that after the apostles had tossed the dice and had seen this worked really well to find St. Matthias as the 12th apostle, they decided they could use this same technique again. The question they had before them was, where should the 12 apostles go to talk about Jesus, to share the gospel? And apparently there had been some fighting about, who got to go to Rome, who got to go to Athens, who got to go to the big cities. And so rather than try to fight it out among themselves, they decided to throw the dice. And everyone threw the dice to determine where they would go. And this time, St. Matthias lost, because he ended up having to go to, according to legend, the city of cannibals. And what the city of cannibals would do was, whenever a stranger came close to the city wall, they would capture the stranger, take the stranger inside the city gates, put the stranger in a cage in the center of town, fatten the stranger up, and then whenever the next feast came, the stranger was the main course. So, according to legend, Matthias walked down to this city on the Mediterranean, And indeed, he was captured, he was put in the cage, he was fattened up, and shortly before he was to become the main course, St. Matthew came and saved him. And then it goes on to say that St. Matthew, in this legend, St. Matthew then converted the entire city to Christianity, and they gave up their cannibal ways. So even in the one story, the one legend, the one, in this case, fake story we have of St. Matthias, he's not the star, and he's not the winner, and he doesn't get the success of converting the city. He's just a prop for St. Matthew to get to come in a rather supernatural fashion and save the day. That's the kind of disrespect Matthias has gotten through the years, or lack of respect maybe be a better way to put it. In fact, today, in this day and age, if you ask someone when is St. Matthias' feast day, you can get 3 or 4 different answers. Unlike the other apostles, there is not even unity in Christianity about what should be a saint day. Tomorrow is a choice. In February there's a choice. There's another one later in May. People can't even decide that, in part because so little is known about it. So you can put it anywhere you want. Now, the nice thing is, nowhere does it say St. Matthias screwed up. Nowhere does it say that the dice had to be tossed again in order to replace Matthias. Nowhere does it say that St. Matthias was such a failure as the substitute apostle that they needed to come up with a new plan. And therefore, I think it is very safe to say that St. Matthias, in a way we do not know, lived out his life in faithful ministry. That he was a good apostle wherever he ended up going, and there are all sorts of legends and different countries that claim him all over the Mediterranean. Whether he died a martyr's death, as some of the legends say, or died of old age in Jerusalem, as another legend says, he lived a life that was respectful, that was faithful, and at least by the claims people make, very effective in sharing the gospel. I think that's a wonderful story to have in mind when we celebrate baptism, like we get to do today for Violet and Abigail. Because the vast majority of Christians at any given time are going to live out lives like St. Matthias, rather than like St. Peter or St. Mary or any of the other biggies that we thoroughly remember. We are much more likely to live out lives of rather anonymous ministry and service and faithfulness. Even the people around us may not know very well that we are Christians, if at all. They may not know how faithful we are in our prayers. They may not notice how nice we are. They may not take note that we're patient and giving. But God does. And certainly, God not only appreciates it, but remembers it. We may be very much like St. Matthias, going who knows where, unremembered places, and yet sharing the gospel effectively. We may touch lives that for only a generation two are remembered before they're forgotten to a tombstone. But we've made those lives better because we were Christians with those people. We're not likely to build great monuments that have our name on a plaque or on a cornerstone. But any of us can live our lives in a way in which the people around us feel love, feel respect, feel forgiveness, feel healing through God. Because it's not that hard to do. It's difficult to do it day after day. We all fail at it at times. Even St. Peter denied Jesus just before he was crucified. But St. Matthias, he's our patron. He's the guy who did who knows what. He's the guy who we don't know how he did it. But we know he did. We know he lived a life of faithful service and generosity. We can count on him living a life of being a good Christian. We can count on him living a life of proclaiming the Gospels. That's what an apostle does. And we can strive for the same. We don't have to worry about going to the city of cannibals. We don't have to wait for St. Matthew to save us. Instead, we simply have to be who God has called us to be in baptism and each day of our lives. to be people who share with generosity the love that God has already given us. It's a very simple formula, and it is so simple that it sometimes becomes as forgotten as St. Matthias. We get caught up in the details and the minutiae or in the big challenges and problems. But the reality of a Christian life is that most days it's simply being a nice person. And sometimes that's hard to do. Most days it's simply loving our neighbor as ourselves. And sometimes that'll be difficult. But when it is, we can think about St. Matthias, who in his time and in his life was able to do that. Not so that great big monuments were built immediately for him, but in a way that he is still remembered simply for being a Christian, simply for being a proclaimer of the gospel and nothing else. Simply being willing to say yes when the dice were thrown and to make those moves on the game board of being an apostle, of being a Christian, of being one who is willing to be sent. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.